The birthday cake sat untouched on the granite counter, 24 pink candles melting into twisted shapes as wax dripped onto the vanilla buttercream. Isolde Chand stared at the mess through tears that blurred her vision, the taste of salt mixing with the bitter aftertaste of her mother's words, still echoing in the suddenly silent kitchen. "Get out! Get out of my house!" The screams had been so loud that Mrs. Patterson next door had turned off her television to listen through the thin walls of the duplex they'd called home for 18 years. The house felt smaller now, suffocating in a way it never had before. Isolde's fingers trembled as she reached for her car keys, the metal cold against her palm despite the July heat that made the air conditioning unit wheeze and struggle. She could still hear her mother's voice, sharp and cutting like broken glass. "You think you're so much better than me? You think your fancy college acceptance letter makes you special? You're nothing, Isolde, nothing but an ungrateful little girl who forgot where she came from." The living room bore the scars of their argument, a knocked-over lamp, magazines scattered across the hardwood floor that Isolde had helped install 2 summers ago when money was tighter and they'd done the work themselves. Her mother, Priya Chand, stood in the doorway now, her sari wrinkled and her usually perfect hair disheveled from running her hands through it in frustration. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her anger had always made her seem larger, more formidable. Today, however, she looked diminished somehow, older than her 48 years. "Mom, please," Isolde whispered, her voice cracking on the words. "I don't understand why you're so upset. The scholarship, it's a good thing. It means I can go to Northwestern without you having to worry about money. Isn't that what we both wanted?" But Priya's face remained stone cold, her dark eyes reflecting none of the warmth that used to light up when she looked at her daughter. "What I wanted was for you to stay here, to help with the business, to remember your family. But you've been planning to leave us behind this whole time, haven't you? Making your secret applications, your secret dreams?" The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke. Isolde thought about the hours she'd spent hunched over her laptop in the public library, carefully crafting essays about her dreams of becoming a social worker, about wanting to help families like theirs navigate the complex systems that often left immigrants feeling lost and voiceless. She'd written about watching her mother work 3 jobs to keep their small apartment, about translating documents at parent-teacher conferences since she was 8 years old, about the pride she felt in her heritage mixed with the exhaustion of always being the bridge between her mother's world and the American dream they'd chased here from Mumbai 15 years ago. "I was going to tell you," Isolde said, her voice stronger now. "I was waiting for today, for my birthday, because I thought we could celebrate together. I thought you'd be proud." A bitter laugh escaped Priya's lips. "Proud? You want me to be proud that my only child can't wait to abandon me? That everything I've sacrificed, every 16-hour day I've worked, every night I've gone to bed with my hands cracked and bleeding from cleaning other people's houses, all of that was so you could run away the first chance you get?" The words cut deeper than any physical blow could have. Isolde remembered those hands, remembered rubbing lotion into them every Sunday night while they watched Bollywood movies on their old television, remembered her mother singing softly in Hindi while she cooked, remembered the stories she'd tell about their family back home, about Isolde's grandmother who had died when Isolde was too young to remember her, but whose recipes lived on in their kitchen. "I'm not running away," Isolde said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm trying to build something better for both of us." "Better?" Priya's voice rose again. "Better than what? Better than this house that I bought with my own hands, my own sweat? Better than the life I've built for us here? You think their world is better than ours?" The question hung heavy with implications that went far beyond college acceptance letters and scholarship offers. It touched on something deeper, something that had been building between them for years as Isolde grew more comfortable in spaces her mother still felt like a visitor in. The honor roll certificates on the refrigerator, the debate team trophies on the mantle, the recommendation letters from teachers who'd never asked how to pronounce their last name. All of it represented a path away from the world Priya knew, towards something she couldn't fully access or understand. Isolde's best friend Maya had called earlier to confirm their dinner plans, her voice bright with excitement about their upcoming freshman year at different colleges. Can you believe we're actually doing this, Is? We're actually getting out of this small town and making something of ourselves. But now those words felt like betrayal, like evidence of the very abandonment her mother accused her of planning. The photograph on the side table caught Isolde's eye. Her and her mother at her high school graduation just 2 months ago, both smiling widely as they posed in front of the auditorium. Priya had worn her best sari that day, the deep blue one with gold threading that she saved for special occasions. She'd cried during the ceremony, not from sadness, but from joy so pure it had made other parents turn to look. "My daughter," she'd whispered to anyone who would listen, "she is going to change the world."
"Where will you go?" Priya asked finally, her anger deflating into something that sounded almost like concern. "Maya's family said I could stay with them until I leave for school," Isolde replied, hating how the words made her mother flinch. "It's just temporary, until we can figure this out." "Figure what out? You've already made your choice. You chose them over me." The accusation was unfair, and they both knew it, but the hurt behind it was real. Isolde wanted to explain that choosing her education, choosing to pursue opportunities that hadn't been available to her mother, wasn't the same as choosing sides in some war between cultures or generations. But the words wouldn't come, blocked by her own confusion and pain. The birthday cake continued its slow melt on the counter. The pink frosting flowers her mother had spent 2 hours perfecting, now sliding down the sides like tears. It had been Isolde's favorite flavor since childhood, vanilla with strawberry filling, and Priya had made it from scratch, despite working a double shift at the hotel the night before. The thoughtfulness of it made everything hurt worse. "I love you, Mom," Isolde said, the words barely audible. "That's never going to change, no matter where I go or what I do. But I can't stay here and pretend I don't have dreams just because they scare you." Priya turned away then, her shoulders rigid with the effort of holding back tears. "Dreams," she repeated, the word bitter in her mouth. "I had dreams too, you know. But I gave them up for you. I thought that's what mothers did. I never asked you to give up anything for me. You didn't have to ask. That's what love is, sacrifice. But I suppose you're too young to understand that yet." The conversation felt circular, each of them speaking past the other, their hurt and fear preventing any real communication. Isolde picked up her suitcase, the weight of it nothing compared to the heaviness in her chest. As she moved toward the door, she caught herself in the hallway mirror, her long black hair disheveled from the argument, her dark eyes red-rimmed from crying, wearing the simple sundress her mother had bought her specifically for her birthday dinner. "Isolde," her mother's voice stopped her at the threshold. "You walk out that door, and things between us, they're going to be different." It wasn't quite a threat, but it wasn't a blessing either. Isolde turned back one last time, memorizing the sight of her mother standing in their living room, surrounded by all the things they'd built together. The furniture they'd assembled from secondhand stores, the plants Priya had nursed back to health from the clearance rack, the family photos that documented their life as a team of two against the world. "I know," Isolde whispered, "but I have to try." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the neighborhood. As she walked to her car, Isolde wondered if this was what growing up really meant. Not just leaving home, but accepting that love wasn't always enough to bridge the gaps between what people needed from each other. The birthday cake would probably end up in the garbage, along with the carefully wrapped present her mother had hidden in the hall closet, thinking Isolde hadn't noticed. But she had noticed. She noticed everything about her mother. The way she hummed when she was happy, the way she rubbed her temples when the bills piled up, the way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window late at night looking out at the stars and speaking quietly in Hindi to people who lived thousands of miles away. Isolde had spent her whole life learning to read her mother's moods and needs, becoming fluent in the language of sacrifice and guilt and love twisted up together until they were impossible to separate. Now, as she drove away from the only home she'd ever known, Isolde couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a terrible mistake. But she also couldn't shake the feeling that staying would be an even worse one. The birthday she'd been looking forward to for months was ending with her homeless and heartbroken, carrying nothing but a suitcase full of clothes and a future that felt more uncertain than ever. The last thing she saw in her rearview mirror was her mother's silhouette in the living room window, small and alone, watching her daughter drive away on what should have been the happiest day of the year. 3 weeks passed in Maya's house like a strange, extended sleepover that nobody was enjoying anymore. Isolde slept on an air mattress in Maya's room, her clothes folded neatly in the corner because she didn't want to impose by using drawer space. Maya's mother, Sarah, had been kind at first, making extra portions at dinner and asking gentle questions about when Isolde might hear from her own mother. But as the days stretched on, the questions became more pointed, the extra portions smaller, and the conversations more stilted. "It's not that you're not welcome," Maya said one morning, as they sat in the backyard drinking coffee and watching Sarah's garden sprinkler create rainbows in the early sunlight. "It's just that Mom's starting to ask questions about how long you're planning to stay, and I don't know what to tell her." Isolde wrapped her hands around her mug, seeking comfort in its warmth, despite the growing heat of the day. "I've been looking for a job, something to get me through until school starts. Maybe I can get a small apartment, just a studio or something." But they both knew that was unrealistic. Isolde had exactly $437 in her checking account, money saved from her part-time job at the library that had ended when school let out. Even the cheapest apartments in their area required first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit that would drain her savings. And that was assuming she could find a landlord willing to rent to an 18-year-old with no credit history and no cosigner. Every morning, Isolde woke up before dawn with a knot in her stomach that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with the growing realization that she was truly on her own, in ways she'd never anticipated. Her mother had always been there, a constant presence that Isolde had sometimes found suffocating, but had never imagined living without. Now, the silence where her mother's voice used to be felt deafening. She'd gotten a job at a local diner, the kind of place that served breakfast all day and had vinyl booths held together with duct tape. The manager, a tired-looking woman named Carol, had hired Isolde on the spot after learning she could work double shifts without complaining. "You got that hungry look," Carol said, not unkindly. "Good. Hungry workers don't quit after their first bad day."
The work was harder than anything Isolde had ever done. Her feet ached constantly from standing on them for 8 or 10 hours at a time, and her hands developed calluses from carrying heavy trays and wiping down tables that never seemed to stay clean for more than 5 minutes. But she threw herself into it with the kind of desperation that came from having no other choice. Every dollar she earned was a dollar closer to independence, to not having to see the increasingly strained smile on Sarah's face when she came home each evening. The customers at the diner were a mix of truck drivers, construction workers, and local families looking for cheap meals. Most were kind enough, though some clearly enjoyed making the young waitress with the foreign-sounding name repeat herself when she took their orders. Isolde learned to speak more slowly, to smile more broadly, to anticipate the moment when someone would ask, "Where are you from?" and decide whether to give the simple answer, "Here," or the complicated one, "My mother came from India, but I was born in Chicago." One particularly difficult customer, a man who came in every Tuesday and Thursday and always complained about something, had looked at her name tag and smirked. "Isolde? What
What kind of name is that? Sounds made up. It's Isolde, she'd corrected gently, the way she'd been doing her entire life. It's actually from a medieval legend about a woman who fell in love with someone she couldn't have. Sounds about right, he'd muttered, leaving a 50-cent tip on a $20 check. Later, Carol had found Isolde crying in the supply closet during her break. Don't let the bastards get to you. Some people got nothing better to do than make other people feel small. But you're bigger than that, I can tell. The kindness had only made Isolde cry harder, because it reminded her of her mother's fierce protectiveness, the way Priya had always stood up for her daughter even when it meant confronting teachers or neighbors or anyone else who made Isolde feel less than worthy. My daughter is brilliant, Priya would say to anyone who would listen. She is going to be somebody important. The memory felt like a knife turning in an old wound. At night, when Maya was asleep and the house was quiet, Isolde would lie on her air mattress and stare at the ceiling, thinking about all the things she wanted to say to her mother. She composed mental letters that she never wrote, practiced conversations that would never happen, imagined scenarios where they could both apologize and start over. But every time she reached for her phone to call, she remembered the look in her mother's eyes when she said things between us are going to be different, and her courage failed her. The Northwestern acceptance letter was pinned to Maya's bulletin board, a constant reminder of the future that had seemed so bright just a month ago. Isolde would stare at it sometimes, wondering if the scholarship would be enough to cover all her expenses now, that she couldn't count on her mother's help with things like textbooks and winter clothes and the thousands of small costs that nobody mentioned when they talked about going to college. She'd called the financial aid office twice, trying to understand her options for additional funding now that her family situation had changed. The conversations were frustrating, full of forms and deadlines and requirements that seemed designed to discourage anyone who wasn't already familiar with navigating institutional bureaucracy. Do you have documentation of the change in your family circumstances? Can your parents sign this form? The questions felt like cruel jokes. Maya tried to be supportive, but the strain was showing in their friendship too. They'd been inseparable since middle school, bonding over their shared love of books and their dreams of leaving their small town for bigger opportunities. But now their conversations felt forced, punctuated by long silences where Maya clearly wanted to talk about college preparation, and Isolde couldn't bring herself to share in the excitement. Maybe you should just call her, Maya suggested one evening as they watched a movie neither of them was really paying attention to. I mean, what's the worst that can happen? She says no? At least you'd know where you stand. But Isolde couldn't explain that the worst thing wasn't her mother saying no, it was her mother saying yes out of guilt or obligation rather than love, creating a relationship built on resentment instead of genuine connection. She'd rather live with uncertainty than with the knowledge that she'd forced her way back into her mother's life against her will.
The diner job was teaching her things about herself that she'd never known. She was stronger than she'd thought, more resilient, capable of working through exhaustion and frustration without breaking down completely. But it was also showing her how quickly circumstances could change, how thin the line was between having a home and being truly adrift. One evening, she overheard Sarah talking to Maya's father in their kitchen, their voices low but not quite quiet enough. "I feel for the girl, I really do," Sarah was saying. "But this isn't a sustainable situation. Maya's leaving for college in 3 weeks, and then what? We can't support someone else's child indefinitely, especially when her own mother—" The sentence trailed off, but Isolde had heard enough. She spent that night staring at apartment listings on her phone, doing math that never worked out in her favor, wondering if there was a way to defer college for a year and work full-time to save money. The thought of postponing her education made her feel sick, but the alternative was becoming increasingly unclear. During her breaks at the diner, Isolde would sometimes walk to the nearby park and sit on a bench under an old oak tree that reminded her of the one in their backyard at home. She'd watch families with young children, couples walking dogs, teenagers who looked carefree in a way she couldn't remember ever feeling. The normalcy of it all made her current situation feel even more surreal. Her phone held dozens of text messages she'd typed but never sent to her mother. "I miss you. I'm sorry for hurting you. Please, can we talk?" Each one felt inadequate, too small to bridge the gulf between them. She'd saved her mother's number under home in her contacts, and seeing that word every time she scrolled through her phone was like pressing on a bruise. The birthday cake had probably been thrown away by now, but Isolde still thought about the time her mother had spent making it perfect, about the tradition they'd built over the years of elaborate birthday celebrations despite their limited budget. Priya had always made Isolde feel like the most important person in the world on her birthday, going without things she needed so she could afford to make the day special. Now Isolde was learning what it meant to go without, to calculate every purchase against her dwindling bank account, to feel grateful for the employee meal she got at the diner because it was one less expense to worry about. The independence she'd craved felt different in practice than it had in her imagination. Lonelier, scarier, full of decisions she wasn't sure she was ready to make. But she was making them anyway, one day at a time, because that was the only choice available to her. And somewhere between learning to balance 5 plates on one arm and memorizing the preferences of regular customers, Isolde was discovering that she was more capable than either she or her mother had ever given her credit for. The question was whether that capability would be enough to carry her through the challenges that lay ahead, and whether the price of proving her independence was worth the loss of the relationship that had defined her entire life up until now. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who looked uncomfortable about the whole situation. Maya had called Isolde at the diner, her voice tight with worry. "You need to come home right now. Something's happened with your mom." Isolde's hands shook as she untied her apron, Carol watching her with concern. "Family emergency," Isolde managed, and Carol nodded, waving her away. "Go, we'll manage." The drive to Maya's house felt endless, even though it was only 15 minutes. Isolde's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Was her mother hurt? Sick? The deputy's presence suggested legal trouble, but what kind? Her mother had always been scrupulously honest about everything, sometimes to her own detriment. Maya was waiting in the driveway when Isolde pulled up, holding a manila envelope that looked official and ominous. The deputy said he tried your house 3 times over the past week. When your mom didn't answer, he came here. He knew you were staying with us. Isolde took the envelope with trembling fingers. The return address was from the county courthouse, and the words "eviction proceedings" were stamped across the top in red ink. Inside, legal documents detailed her mother's failure to make mortgage payments for the past 4 months, despite multiple notices and opportunities to cure the default. 4 months, Isolde whispered, sinking onto Maya's porch steps. She hasn't paid the mortgage in 4 months. That means the problem started before our fight, before my birthday.
The timeline was devastating in its implications. While Isolde had been planning for college, writing scholarship essays about her mother's strength and sacrifice, Priya had been quietly drowning in financial trouble. The fight about Northwestern, the anger about Isolde leaving, it all took on a different meaning now. "There's more," Maya said gently, sitting beside her. "The deputy said there have been other issues. Something about the business license for your mom's catering service and unpaid taxes." Isolde felt like she was seeing her entire childhood from a different angle, understanding suddenly why her mother had always seemed so tired, why there were hushed phone conversations that ended when Isolde entered the room, why Priya had sometimes stared at bills for long minutes before folding them up and putting them away without comment. "I have to go see her," Isolde said, standing up so quickly that Maya had to grab her arm to steady her. "Are you sure that's a good idea? I mean, you said she told you." "I don't care what she told me. She's losing the house, Maya. Our house. The house she bought with her own hands, remember? I can't let that happen without at least trying to help." The drive to her childhood home took her through neighborhoods she'd known her entire life, past the elementary school where she'd first learned to speak English, past the community center where her mother had taught cooking classes to other immigrant families, past the grocery store where they'd shopped together every Saturday morning for 18 years. Everything looked the same, but Isolde felt like she was seeing it all for the first time, understanding the weight of responsibility her mother had carried alone. The house looked smaller than she remembered, and definitely more run down. The grass needed cutting, there were newspapers piled up on the front porch, and the paint was peeling around the window frames. Had it always looked like this, or had a month of Priya's distraction taken its toll? Isolde parked in the driveway and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Before she could change her mind, she walked to the front door and knocked. It felt strange to knock on the door of the house where she'd grown up, but she didn't feel like she had the right to just walk in anymore. After a long moment, she heard footsteps, and then the door opened to reveal her mother. Priya looked exhausted in a way that went beyond simple tiredness. She'd lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her small frame, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. For a moment, mother and daughter just stared at each other, the space between them feeling both vast and intimate. "Isolde," Priya said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "What are you doing here?" "I got the eviction notice," Isolde held up the envelope. "Mom, why didn't you tell me things were this bad?" Priya's face closed off, her expression becoming the same stone mask that had confronted Isolde on her birthday. "That's not your concern anymore. You made your choice." "My choice was to go to college, not to abandon you. There's a difference, even if you can't see it." "Is there?" Priya stepped back from the door, but didn't close it, a gesture that was neither welcoming nor dismissive. "You've been gone a month. Have you called? Have you checked to see how I'm doing? Or were you too busy with your new life to think about your old one?" The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Isolde had been so wrapped up in her own hurt feelings, her own struggles with homelessness and financial insecurity, that she hadn't considered what her mother might be going through. But she'd also been following Priya's own directive to stay away, to accept that things between us were different now. "You told me to leave," Isolde said. "You made it very clear that you didn't want me here. I told you that walking out the door would change things between us. I didn't tell you to never come back." The distinction felt important, though Isolde wasn't sure she understood all its implications. They stood there in the doorway, neither fully inside nor outside, in a space that seemed to mirror their relationship, undefined, uncomfortable, but not entirely without hope. "Can I come in?" Isolde asked fawnily, "so we can talk about this properly?" Priya hesitated, then stepped aside. The living room looked much the same as it had a month ago, except for the stacks of papers covering every available surface: bills, legal documents, bank statements, and what looked like business correspondence. The organized chaos of someone trying to solve an overwhelming problem with insufficient resources. "How bad is it?" Isolde asked, taking in the scope of the paperwork. "Bad enough." Priya moved to the couch, gathering up some of the papers to make room for them to sit. "The catering business has been struggling for months. People cancel orders, they book parties and then don't pay. They want elaborate food for clearance prices. And then there are regulations, licenses, health department inspections that cost money every time they come out." Isolde listened as her mother detailed a cascade of financial troubles that had been building for longer than she'd realized. The catering business that was supposed to provide stable income had instead become a source of constant stress and irregular payments. Priya had been borrowing against the house to keep the business afloat, hoping things would turn around, unwilling to admit that her American dream was failing. "The mortgage company has been calling for months," Priya continued, her voice growing quieter. "At first, I thought I could catch up, work more hours, book more events. But every time I got a little ahead, something else would happen. The car needed repairs, the refrigerator broke, the insurance premiums went up." "Why didn't you tell me any of this?" Isolde asked. "I could have helped, or at least we could have figured something out together." "With what?" Priya's laugh was bitter. "You're 18 years old with no money and no credit. What exactly were you going to do? Besides, you were so focused on your college plans, your scholarship, your future that didn't include me. I wasn't going to burden you with my failures." The word failures hit Isolde like a physical blow. Her mother, who had always seemed so strong and competent, who had navigated immigration and single parenthood and building a life from nothing, that woman saw herself as failing. It was a perspective that had never occurred to Isolde, who had always viewed her mother's struggles as temporary setbacks rather than fundamental defeats. "You're not failing," Isolde said firmly. "You're dealing with a system that's designed to make it hard for people like us to succeed. That's not the same thing." "People like us," Priya repeated. "You still think you're part of us, even after you chose them over me?" We were back to this, the fundamental disagreement that had started their fight in the first place. But now Isolde understood it differently, saw that her mother's anger wasn't really about college or scholarships or even about leaving. It was about fear. Fear of being left behind, fear of losing the only family she had, fear of facing her problems alone. "I never chose anyone over you. I chose to pursue opportunities that you made possible for me. Everything I've achieved, it's because of what you've given me. The work ethic, the determination, the belief that I could do anything if I was willing to work hard enough, all of that came from you." "Pretty words," Priya said, but her voice was softer now, less defensive. "But words don't pay mortgages." Isolde looked around at the papers scattered everywhere, at her mother's exhausted face, and at the house that had been their sanctuary and was now under threat. An idea was forming in her mind. Crazy, and probably impossible, but the only one that made sense given their situation.
"What if I deferred college for a year?" she said. "Just 1 year. I could work full-time, help you get caught up on the payments, maybe help you restructure the business so it's more profitable." "Absolutely not." Priya's response was immediate and fierce. "You are not giving up your education for me. That scholarship, that opportunity, it's everything we've worked toward." "It's everything you've worked toward," Isolde corrected. "And if you lose the house, if you lose everything you've built here, then what was the point of any of it?" They sat in silence for a moment, both understanding the impossible position they were in. Isolde's education represented hope for their future, but that future meant nothing if Priya lost everything in the present. The American dream that had brought them this far suddenly felt more like an American trap, forcing them to choose between family loyalty and individual advancement. "There has to be another way," Priya said finally. "Some option we haven't thought of." Isolde picked up one of the legal documents, scanning it for details about the foreclosure process. "How much time do we have?" 6 weeks. Maybe 8 if I can get an extension." "And how much do you need to bring the payments current?" Priya pulled out a calculator and a stack of bills, her fingers moving quickly over the numbers she'd obviously calculated dozens of times before. $14,000, she said. That would cover the back payments, late fees, and legal costs. It might as well have been $14 million for all the accessibility it had to them. Isolde's total savings were less than $300 after a month of working at the diner. Even if she worked double shifts every day until the foreclosure, she couldn't earn that kind of money. "What about family?" Isolde asked. "Your sister in California or your cousin in New Jersey?" "Already asked." Priya's voice was flat with embarrassment. "They have their own struggles. Raj lost his job last month, and Mira's husband is having health problems. Everyone's just trying to survive." The isolation of their situation struck Isolde forcefully. They were part of a community of immigrants who were all facing similar challenges: underemployment, language barriers, discrimination, and the constant pressure to succeed in a system that wasn't designed for their success. In helping each other, they were all just redistributing the same inadequate resources. "Okay," Isolde said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Then we need to think bigger. What assets do we have? What options haven't we explored?" For the next hour, they went through every possibility they could think of. Selling Priya's catering equipment, though it wouldn't bring much and would eliminate her source of income. Taking out a personal loan, though Priya's credit was already damaged by the missed mortgage payments. Bankruptcy, though that would mean losing the house anyway and destroying any chance of financial recovery. As they talked, Isolde began to see the full scope of her mother's struggle over the past year. The birthday cake, the special dinner plans, even the sari she'd worn to Isolde's graduation. It had all been purchased with money that should have gone to bills, gestures of love that had made their financial situation worse. You've been protecting me from all of this, Isolde realized. Even when I was still living here, you were hiding how bad things really were. That's what mothers do, Priya simply said. We carry the weight so our children don't have to. But I'm not a child anymore. I'm an adult, and I should have been helping you carry the weight instead of adding to it with college applications and scholarship interviews, and all the time I spent focused on my own future.
Your future is my future, Priya said. If you succeed, then everything I've done will have been worth it. If you fail because you stayed to help me with problems that might not be solvable anyway, then I will have failed you twice, once as a provider and once as a mother. The circular logic of love and sacrifice was making Isolde's head spin. They were both so focused on protecting each other that they'd ended up in a situation where no protection was possible, where every choice led to loss. As the afternoon wore on and the stacks of bills began to look less like puzzles to be solved and more like evidence of inevitable defeat, Isolde found herself thinking about the eviction notice and what it would mean for her mother to lose this house, not just financially, but emotionally, to lose the symbol of everything she'd accomplished, the proof that she'd made it in America despite all the obstacles in her way. "Mom," she said quietly, "whatever happens with the house, we're gonna figure this out together. I'm not gonna let you face this alone anymore." Priya looked at her daughter, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd opened the door. "You look older, thinner. Are you eating enough?" The question was so quintessentially maternal, so focused on Isolde's well-being, despite everything Priya was dealing with, that it broke something open in Isolde's chest. "I'm fine," though they both knew it was a lie. "I'm working at Murphy's Diner, and Maya's family has been letting me stay with them." "Maya's family?" Priya's voice carried a note of something that might have been regret. "They're good people. I should call Sarah. Thank her for taking care of you." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do." Priya stood up, moving toward the kitchen with more energy than she'd shown since Isolde arrived. "I may have been angry with you, but that doesn't excuse me from basic courtesy. And I need to make sure you're really okay." As her mother busied herself making tea, always her response to crisis, as if the ritual of boiling water and steeping leaves could solve any problem, Isolde found herself really looking at the house for the first time in years, not as the familiar backdrop of her childhood, but as the achievement it represented. Every piece of furniture had been carefully chosen and saved for. Every improvement, from the hardwood floors to the updated kitchen fixtures, represented months of extra work and careful budgeting. The photographs on the mantel told the story of their life together. Isolde's school pictures from kindergarten through high school graduation, family celebrations, the day they'd closed on the house when Isolde was 10. In that photo, Priya was holding the keys and grinning so widely that her cheeks must have hurt, while Isolde was standing beside her with a gap-toothed smile, both of them dusty from moving boxes, but radiating pure joy. "Do you remember what you said when we first walked through this place?" Priya asked from the kitchen, as if she could sense Isolde's thoughts. "I said it was too big for just two people. And you said we'd grow into it. We did grow into it. You did your homework at that kitchen table for 8 years. You learned to drive in this driveway. You brought Maya here for sleepovers and study sessions and heartbreak recovery sessions when boys were stupid to both of you. The house had been more than shelter. It had been the foundation that allowed them to build a life, to feel secure enough to dream bigger dreams. Losing it wouldn't just be a financial catastrophe. It would be the loss of every memory contained within these walls, every marker of their progress from struggling immigrants to solidly middle-class Americans." "There's something else," Priya said, returning with 2 cups of tea and settling back onto the couch. "Something I haven't told you about the business problems." Isolde felt her stomach drop. How much worse could things get? "You remember Mrs. Hendricks from the country club? She hired me to cater her daughter's engagement party last month. 200 people. Very expensive menu. It was going to be enough money to get cut up on at least 2 mortgage payments. What happened?"
Nothing happened. Everything went perfectly. The food was excellent. The service was flawless. Everyone complimented the meal.
But when it came time to pay, Priya's voice trailed off, and she stared into her teacup as if it might contain answers. She didn't pay you? She paid me, but not the full amount. She claimed there were problems with the appetizers, said they were cold, though I know they weren't because I checked the warming trays every 15 minutes. She docked my payment by 30% and said I should be grateful she was paying me anything at all. The injustice of it made Isolde's hands clench into fists. That's wage theft. You could report her, take her to small claims court. With what money? And what lawyer and what judge is going to believe me over her? Priya's voice was bitter, but resigned. She knows I can't fight her, so she can do whatever she wants. And she's not the only one. It's happening more and more. People booking my services, getting exactly what they pay for, and then finding reasons to pay less than we agreed on. That's not fair. That's not legal. Fair and legal aren't the same thing when you're in my position, Priya said. When you're dependent on their recommendations for future business, when you can't afford to get a reputation for being difficult, you take what they give you and smile and say thank you. The conversation was revealing layers of exploitation that Isolde had never understood before. Her mother's business wasn't just struggling because of economic factors or poor planning. It was being systematically undermined by clients who knew they could cheat someone without recourse. How long has this been going on? About a year? Maybe longer? It started small. Someone claiming they'd asked for one thing when I knew they'd ask for another. Small deductions here and there that I couldn't prove were wrong. But it's gotten worse as word spread that I wouldn't make a fuss. Word spread? The implication was chilling. These people all know each other. They talk at their country clubs and their charity events and their garden parties. Oh, you can shortchange Priya Chand. She won't make a trouble. She needs the business too much to complain. Isolde felt sick thinking about her mother enduring this kind of treatment month after month, working harder for less money while being blamed for problems that didn't exist. The American dream her mother had chased suddenly looked more like an American nightmare, full of people willing to exploit someone's vulnerability for their own benefit. We need to document this, Isolde said, her mind racing. Keep records of every interaction, every payment discrepancy. Maybe we can't fight it individually, but if there's a pattern, what pattern? A pattern of immigrant businesses being treated poorly? A pattern of wealthy people taking advantage of service providers who can't fight back? Everyone already knows that happens. Knowing it and being able to do something about it are two different things. The hopelessness in her mother's voice was harder to bear than the anger had been. Anger suggested that Priya still believed things could change, that there was fight left in her. This resignation was worse. It suggested that she'd given up not just on saving the house, but on the possibility that the system could ever work fairly for people like them. There has to be something we can do, Isolde insisted. Some way to fight back.
The only way to fight back is to not need them anymore, Priya said. To be successful enough, established enough, that their approval doesn't matter. But that takes money we don't have and time we've run out of. They sat in silence again, the weight of their situation settling around them like a heavy blanket. Outside, the neighborhood was coming alive with the sounds of evening, children playing in yards, dogs barking, the distant hum of lawnmowers. Normal sounds of normal lives, which their life had stopped being sometime in the past year without Isolde even realizing it. I keep thinking about that birthday cake, Isolde said suddenly. You spent your grocery money on ingredients for that cake, didn't you? Priya didn't answer, but her expression was confirmation enough. And my graduation dinner. And the new dress you bought me for the scholarship interview. How much money did you spend on me while you were already behind on the mortgage? That money wasn't wasted, Priya said firmly. Celebrating your achievements, supporting your dreams, that's not waste, that's investment in the future. But what future are we investing in if we lose everything in the present? It was the same circular argument they'd been having in different forms for weeks, the same impossible choice between immediate survival and long-term hope.
But now Isolde understood that it wasn't really a choice at all. It was a trap designed to make people like them fail no matter what decisions they made. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Priya glanced at the caller ID and sighed. Mortgage company. They call twice a day now. Answer it, Isolde said. Maybe we can negotiate something, buy ourselves more time. I've tried negotiating. They're not interested in anything less than full payment. But Isolde was already reaching for the phone. Let me try. Sometimes they'll talk to adult children differently than they talk to the primary borrower. The conversation that followed was frustrating and demoralizing. The customer service representative was polite but inflexible, reading from scripts that offered no real solutions for people in their situation. Yes, they could apply for a modification, but the approval process would take longer than they had before foreclosure. Yes, there were hardship programs, but they required documentation of circumstances that had already been rejected once. What about a payment plan? Isolde asked. Something that would bring the account current over time instead of requiring a lump sum. I'm sorry, but the account has already been referred to legal for foreclosure proceedings. At this point, only full payment of the arrearage can stop the process. After Isolde hung up, she and her mother sat staring at each other across the coffee table, covered with bills and legal documents. The official nature of their conversation with the mortgage company had made their situation feel even more real, more urgent. $14,000, Isolde said, more to herself than to her mother. In 6 weeks. It's impossible, Priya said flatly. I've looked at this from every angle, run every calculation. There's no way to earn that much money in that amount of time. Not legally. But Isolde's mind was working differently now, approaching the problem not as her mother's dependent child, but as her partner in solving it. What if we're thinking about this wrong? She said slowly. What if instead of trying to earn $14,000, we focused on finding someone who would lend it to us? We tried that, Priya said. The banks won't approve a personal loan, and I don't have anything left to use as collateral. Not a bank loan, something else, someone else.
What about the house itself? Isolde continued, the idea forming as she spoke. What if we could get someone to buy it from us for enough to pay off the mortgage, but then rent it back to us? That way we wouldn't lose our home, but we also wouldn't lose everything to foreclosure. That's not how real estate works, Priya said. And besides, who would want to get involved in something like that? I don't know yet, but maybe it doesn't matter how real estate normally works. Maybe what we need is an arrangement that doesn't fit normal categories. For the first time since Isolde had arrived, her mother looked hopeful instead of just exhausted. You really think there might be a way? I think we haven't exhausted all our options yet, Isolde replied, and I think we're stronger together than we are apart. Whether I go to college this year or next year, whether we keep this house or find somewhere else to live, we're going to figure it out as a team. The conversation had shifted something fundamental between them, not back to the relationship they'd had before, that was probably impossible, but towards something new, built on mutual respect and shared responsibility instead of the old dynamic of provider and dependent. As evening settled over the house and the shadows grew longer across the living room floor, Isolde realized that this crisis, as terrible as it was, had also given them something they'd never had before, the chance to be real partners, to face their problems as equals, instead of as parent and child. Whether that partnership would be enough to save their home remained to be seen, but for the first time in weeks, both of them believed it might be possible. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor, who had overheard the birthday fight and had been watching the house with growing concern ever since. 3 days after Isolde's reconciliation visit with her mother, she appeared at their front door carrying a casserole dish and wearing an expression of determined kindness. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," she said when Priya answered the door, "but I've been worried about both of you, and I think it's time we had a proper conversation." Isolde was in the kitchen, helping her mother organize the financial paperwork into more manageable categories when Mrs. Patterson's voice carried through from the living room. They'd been working together every evening for 3 days, approaching their crisis with the methodical patience that had gotten Priya through immigration paperwork and Isolde through high school calculus. "Mrs. Patterson," Priya said, accepting the casserole with the gracious politeness she'd never lost despite years in America. "You're very kind, but you don't need to worry about us." "Nonsense," the older woman replied briskly. "Neighbors worry about neighbors. That's how communities work. And from what I can see, you've been dealing with some serious challenges lately." Isolde stiffened, her pride clearly stinging at the idea that her private troubles had become neighborhood gossip. "I appreciate your concern, but nothing," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "Pride is a luxury you can't afford right now. And besides, what I know might actually help you."
She pulled a manila folder from her large purse, the kind of organized preparation that marked her as someone who had spent decades helping people navigate crises. "I've been doing some research since I heard about your situation. There are programs, options, legal protections that you might not know about." "We've looked into everything," Isolde said, settling beside her mother on the couch. "The mortgage company says there's nothing they can do without full payment." "The mortgage company," Mrs. Patterson said with a snort of derision, "has a vested interest in making you believe that. Foreclosures are profitable for them. They get to sell the property, often for more than the amount owed, and keep all the proceeds. Why would they want to help you avoid that?" She opened her folder and pulled out several printed articles and legal documents. "There's a state program for homeowners facing foreclosure due to predatory lending practices. Another one specifically for small business owners who have experienced discrimination or exploitation. And there are legal aid organizations that specialize in housing issues for immigrant families." "Predatory lending?" Priya asked. "But we had a normal mortgage from a regular bank." "Normal mortgages can become predatory through their servicing," Mrs. Patterson explained. "Excessive fees, unclear communication about payment options, steering people toward foreclosure instead of modification. It's more common than you think, especially with borrowers who are seen as vulnerable." She handed them a stack of papers. "These are complaint forms for the State Banking Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and the State Attorney General's office. Filing these complaints won't necessarily save your house, but it might buy you time and put pressure on the mortgage company to negotiate in good faith." Isolde scanned the forms, feeling a surge of hope mixed with frustration. "Why didn't anyone tell us about these options before?" "Because the system is designed to make you feel like you have no options," Mrs. Patterson replied. "People in crisis are easier to exploit when they think they're powerless. But you're not powerless. You're just underinformed." For the next hour, Mrs. Patterson walked them through a maze of bureaucratic possibilities that neither Isolde nor Priya had known existed. Emergency assistance programs through the county, legal challenges to foreclosure proceedings, mediation services that could force mortgage companies to consider alternatives to foreclosure. "None of these are guaranteed solutions," she warned, "but they're tools, and tools give you leverage. The more pressure you can apply from different angles, the more likely the mortgage company is to work with you instead of against you." "This is incredible," Isolde said, though she was also feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. "But why would you go to all this trouble for us? We're not even really friends, just neighbors who wave to each other in the driveway." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened. 40 years ago, when my husband died and I was facing bankruptcy and the loss of this house, a neighbor I barely knew showed up at my door with information that saved my family. She'd spent her weekend researching options for widows in financial distress, purely out of kindness. She gestured around the living room, which Isolde certainly realized was filled with the same loving attention to detail that characterized their own home. "I've lived in this house for 43 years because of that woman's generosity. She taught me that sometimes being a good neighbor means being nosy, and sometimes helping people means doing homework they don't have the energy to do for themselves."
"But this is so much work," Priya protested. "All this research, all these forms. is what I do, Mrs. Patterson said simply. I'm retired, my children live in other states, and I have more time than I know what to do with. This gives me purpose. Besides, she added with a slight smile, I really enjoyed taking on predatory lenders. Consider it a hobby. The conversation shifted then from gratitude to strategy. Mrs. Patterson had not only researched programs and legal options, she had contacts, phone numbers for people who could expedite applications, and lawyers who worked on sliding scale fees. She had a network built over decades of professional and volunteer work, connections that could open doors that Isolde and Priya hadn't even known existed. There's something else, Mrs. Patterson said as they reached the bottom of her folder, something that might be more immediately helpful. I've been talking to people at the community center, people who have used your catering services. Isolde felt her mother tense beside her, clearly expecting more bad news about dissatisfied customers. The feedback is overwhelmingly positive, Mrs. Patterson continued. People love your food, they love your professionalism, they love your prices. But they're also concerned about some of the stories they've heard about clients not paying properly.
You've heard about that too? Priya asked, her voice small. I've heard about Mrs. Hendricks specifically, Mrs. Patterson replied, her tone sharp with disapproval, and about the Thompsons and the Kellys, and at least 3 other families who have a reputation for stiffing service providers. What you've experienced isn't unique. It's part of a pattern of behavior that the immigrant business community has been dealing with for years. She pulled out another set of papers. These are contact information for other business owners who have had similar experiences, and for an organization called the Community Investment Cooperative. They help service providers document exploitation and, when possible, recover unpaid wages through collective action. The idea that their struggles were part of a larger pattern was both comforting and infuriating. Comforting because it meant they weren't alone, that Priya's business problems weren't the result of her own inadequacy. Infuriating because it meant that what had happened to them was happening to others, systematically and without consequences. How many other people has Mrs. Hendricks cheated? Isolde asked. According to my sources, you're the 4th catering service she's shortchanged in the past 2 years. Always the same story. Claims about food quality that her guests contradict, deductions from agreed-upon payments, veiled threats about her influence with other potential clients. And nothing happens to her? Nothing has happened to her yet, Mrs. Patterson corrected, but patterns like this, when they're properly documented and reported to the right agencies, can lead to legal consequences: consumer fraud, unfair business practices, violation of contract laws. There are options for holding people accountable. The conversation was revealing a different way of thinking about their problems. Instead of isolated crises that had to be endured alone, they were seeing their challenges as part of systemic issues that could be addressed through community action and proper use of legal protections. I have one more thing, Mrs. Patterson said, reaching into her purse again. Something that might help with your immediate cash flow problem. She pulled out a business card for something called the Community Investment Cooperative. This is a local organization that provides small loans to immigrant-owned businesses. They're not a bank. They're funded by community members who want to support local entrepreneurship. Their interest rates are reasonable, and they understand the kinds of challenges you've been facing.
We've already been turned down for loans, Priya said. My credit is damaged from the missed mortgage payments. This isn't a traditional loan, Mrs. Patterson explained. It's more like community investment. They look at your business plan, your track record, your potential for success, not just your credit score. And they have programs specifically for businesses that have been harmed by client exploitation. The possibility of accessing capital through community support, rather than traditional banking, felt revolutionary to Isolde. It suggested that there were alternative systems, parallel economies, that operated on different principles than the ones that had been failing her family. There's one catch, Mrs. Patterson continued.
They require borrowers to participate in their business development program, monthly meetings, financial planning workshops, networking events with other immigrant entrepreneurs. It's part of their model, supporting not just individual businesses, but building a stronger community of business owners who can help each other succeed. That doesn't sound like a catch, Isolde said. That sounds like exactly what we need. For the first time in months, Priya was smiling. Not the forced smile she'd worn while dealing with difficult customers, but the genuine expression of someone who had just discovered that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. You really think they might be able to help? I think they're worth a conversation, Mrs. Patterson replied. The woman who runs the program is named Sofia Hernandez. She started her own business 10 years ago after going through some of the same challenges you're facing now. I've already called her and explained your situation. She's expecting to hear from you. The afternoon had transformed from a social visit into a strategy session, with papers spread across the coffee table and 3 women hunched over documents like generals planning a campaign. Isolde found herself taking notes, creating action items, assigning responsibilities. The helplessness that had characterized their situation for so long was being replaced by a sense of agency, of concrete steps they could take to fight back. I can't thank you enough, Priya said, as Mrs. Patterson began gathering up her materials. This information, these contacts, it's more help than we dared to hope for. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Patterson replied. Thank me when you've saved your house and rebuilt your business. But I will say this. Watching you two work together this afternoon, I have a good feeling about your chances. After Mrs. Patterson left, Isolde and her mother sat in their living room surrounded by new possibilities. The mountain of problems hadn't disappeared, but it no longer looked impossible to climb. They had tools now and allies, and most importantly, they had each other. I keep thinking about what she said, Isolde said, as they began organizing their new paperwork. About pride being a luxury we can't afford. I think I've been carrying around a lot of pride about doing this alone, about not needing help from anyone. We both have, Priya agreed. I think I was so afraid of being seen as failing that I couldn't ask for help even when I desperately needed it. And I was so afraid of you seeing me as weak that I couldn't tell you how bad things really were. You're not weak, Isolde said firmly. You're the strongest person I know. But strength doesn't mean you have to carry everything alone. The conversation felt like a continuation of the healing that had begun 3 days earlier, another layer of honesty and understanding being built between them. They were learning to see each other not just as mother and daughter, but as partners in building the life they both wanted. What do you think about this business development program? Priya asked. The networking events and workshops? That sounds like exactly what I need to learn. How to protect myself better, how to grow the business in a more sustainable way. I think it sounds perfect, Isolde replied. And I think I should participate too. Even if I go to college this year or next year, I want to understand your business better. I want to be able to help you in more meaningful ways than just organizing paperwork. The idea of working together, of building something together, felt natural in a way that their previous relationship dynamics hadn't. They were moving beyond the old pattern of Priya sacrificing for Isolde's future towards something more mutual, more collaborative.
As evening approached, they made their action plan for the following day. Priya would call Sofia Hernandez at the Community Investment Cooperative, while Isolde would contact the legal aid organization about housing counseling services. They would divide the bureaucratic forms between them, tackle the complaint processes as a team. Whatever happens, Isolde said as they stood up to start dinner, we're not going to face this alone anymore. We have neighbors who care about us, organizations that can help us, other business owners who understand what we're going through. We're part of a community, even if it took a crisis for us to realize it. The house around them looked the same as it had that morning, but it felt different somehow. Less like a sanctuary under siege, and more like a home worth fighting for. They weren't just trying to avoid foreclosure anymore.
They were fighting for their place in a community that was bigger and more supportive than either of them had realized. The birthday cake was long gone, but the sweetness of possibility was filling the kitchen as they cooked together, planning not just for survival, but for a future that might actually be better than the past they'd been trying so hard to preserve. 6 weeks later, Isolde stood in the kitchen of their house, their saved house, watching her mother put finishing touches on a spread of food that would feed 30 people. The Community Investment Cooperative's monthly meeting was being hosted at their home for the first time, and Priya had insisted on preparing a feast that would showcase not just her culinary skills, but her gratitude for everything the organization had made possible. The approval loan had come through 3 weeks after their initial meeting with Sofia Hernandez, but not before a whirlwind of paperwork, business plan development, and financial counseling sessions that had transformed how they thought about money, debt, and business ownership. The $14,000 they'd needed to save the house had been restructured as an investment in Priya's catering business, with a repayment plan that accounted for the seasonal nature of her income and built-in protections against the kind of client exploitation they'd experienced before. More than that, Sofia had explained during their final approval meeting, we're not just giving you money. We're giving you membership in a community of business owners who support each other, share resources, and help each other navigate challenges that banks and traditional lenders don't understand. The transformation in Priya over those 3 weeks had been remarkable. The exhausted, defeated woman who had answered the door on that August afternoon was gone, replaced by someone who moved with renewed purpose and confidence. She had learned to speak the language of business plans and profit margins, had developed systems for tracking expenses and managing client relationships, had connected with other entrepreneurs who had faced similar challenges and found ways to overcome them. The samosas are almost ready, she called to Isolde, who was arranging folding chairs in the living room. Can you check on the doll? The evening's agenda included presentations from 3 cooperative members about their businesses, a workshop on contract law for service providers, and a discussion of the collective action they were planning against clients who had a pattern of exploiting immigrant business owners. Mrs. Hendrick's name was on that list, along with several others who thought they could cheat people with impunity. Isolde stirred the doll and tasted it for seasoning, a skill she'd developed during weeks of working alongside her mother in ways that felt entirely different from the childhood chore assignments she remembered. They were collaborating now, both in the kitchen and in the business planning sessions that had become a regular part of their evenings. Perfect as always, she said, adding a pinch of salt. How are you feeling about tonight? Nervous, Priya admitted, checking the samosas in the oven. But good nervous, excited nervous. I keep thinking about how isolated I felt just 2 months ago, how impossible everything seemed. And now we're hosting 30 business owners in our living room.
The doorbell rang, and Isolde went to answer it, finding Sofia Hernandez and 2 other cooperative members on the front porch carrying boxes of materials for the evening's workshops. Sofia was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and laugh lines that spoke to someone who had found reasons to smile despite facing challenges that might have broken other people. How are you feeling about the presentation? She asked Priya as they set up materials in the living room. Remember, you're not just telling your story. You're helping other people understand that the problems they're facing aren't individual failures. Over the past month, Priya had become something of a case study within the cooperative, her experience with exploitative clients serving as an example of broader issues that affected many immigrant-owned service businesses. Her willingness to document her experiences and share them with other members had helped identify patterns of discrimination and exploitation that were affecting the entire community. I never thought of myself as someone who would speak publicly about personal problems, Priya said, arranging plates of food on the dining room table. But if sharing what we went through can help other families avoid the same situation, then it feels important. People began arriving at 6:30, filling their living room with a buzz of conversation in multiple languages. Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, Mandarin, and English blending together in the multilingual symphony of American entrepreneurship. Isolde found herself serving as an informal translator and host, helping people find seats and connecting newcomers with established members who shared similar business challenges.
The evening's first presentation was from a man named Hassan, who had built a successful landscaping business after years of struggling with clients who demanded professional results but balked at paying professional rates. His story resonated strongly with Priya's experience. The same pattern of exploitation disguised as market negotiation, the same challenges of building a sustainable business while dealing with customers who viewed immigrant service providers as inherently less valuable. The key, Hassan said during the question and answer period, was learning to value my own work appropriately and to refuse clients who weren't willing to pay for the quality they expected. It took time to build a client base that respected professional standards, but it was worth it. When it was Priya's turn to present, she spoke with a clarity and confidence that surprised even Isolde. She detailed her experience with client exploitation, the financial cascade that had nearly cost them their home, and the systematic nature of the problems that many cooperative members had faced. But she also talked about solutions, the legal protections they had discovered, the community resources that were available, and the power of collective action to address individual problems. For too long, I tried to solve these problems alone, she said, looking around the room at faces that reflected understanding and solidarity. I thought asking for help was admitting failure, but I've learned that isolation is what allows exploitation to continue. When we support each other, when we share information and resources, when we refuse to be picked off one by one, that's when real change becomes possible. The response was overwhelming. Several people approached her after the presentation to share similar experiences, to ask for advice about dealing with difficult clients, to exchange contact information for potential collaboration. Isolde watched her mother navigate these conversations with the grace and authority of someone who had found her place in a community that valued her contributions. The workshop on contract law was led by a cooperative member who is also a lawyer, and it provided practical tools that Isolde could see her mother absorbing and planning to implement. Standard contract language that protected service providers from arbitrary payment reductions, documentation requirements that would make it harder for clients to fabricate complaints, resources for legal recourse when contracts were violated. Knowledge is power, the lawyer said. But organized knowledge shared among community members is systemic change. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Isolde found herself in conversation with several cooperative members who were close to her own age, children of immigrant entrepreneurs who were balancing their own educational and career aspirations with their desire to support their families' businesses.
It's not about choosing between your dreams and your family, said Maria, whose mother ran a house cleaning service and who was starting her junior year at the local community college. It's about finding ways to make your dreams include your family and make your family's success include your dreams. The perspective was exactly what Isolde had been struggling to articulate for months. Her acceptance to Northwestern was still valid, though she had deferred enrollment for a year to help stabilize her mother's business and their living situation. But that deferral no longer felt like a sacrifice or a step backward. It felt like an intentional choice to build something sustainable before moving to the next phase of her life. I'm thinking about studying business administration instead of social work, she told Maria, or maybe combining them somehow. I want to understand how to help families navigate systems, but I also want to understand how to build systems that work better for families in the first place. The conversation continued as they helped clean up from the evening, with several people offering perspectives on educational paths that would allow Isolde to support her community while pursuing her own professional development. The either-or thinking that had characterized her relationship with college was being replaced by both and possibilities that felt much more sustainable. After everyone left, Isolde and her mother sat in their living room, surrounded by the evidence of a successful evening. Empty serving dishes, folding chairs that needed to be returned to their storage closet, business cards scattered across the coffee table, and the lingering warmth of community connection that filled the space like incense. I keep thinking about what Hassan said, about learning to value his own work appropriately. I don't think I ever really understood what that meant until tonight. What do you think it means now? Isolde asked, settling onto the couch with her own tea and pulling a throw blanket over her legs. I think it means understanding that the price of my labor includes not only the time I spend cooking and serving, but the years I spent learning these skills, the emotional energy I put into making people's events special, the risk I take every time I invest in ingredients and supplies without knowing for certain that I'll be paid fairly. The insight represented a fundamental shift in how Priya thought about her business. For too long, she had priced her services based on what she thought people would be willing to pay, rather than what her work was actually worth. The cooperative's business development workshops had taught her to calculate her true costs, including her time, her expertise, and the value she brought to her clients' events. Sophia said something today that really stuck with me about how immigrant entrepreneurs often undervalue themselves because we're so grateful for the opportunity to work that we forget we're providing value, not just receiving it. Exactly. I was so focused on being grateful for each job that I forgot to expect clients to be grateful for the quality of service I provided. The conversation reflected months of personal and professional transformation that had begun with Mrs. Patterson's intervention and continued through their participation in the cooperative. Priya's business was not only more financially stable now, it was more sustainable, built on relationships with clients who valued her work rather than those who sought to exploit her vulnerability. The collective action against exploitative clients had also borne fruit. Mrs. Hendricks had quietly settled several complaints against her after the state attorney general's office opened an investigation into her business practices. Other problematic clients had been put on notice that their behavior was being documented and would have consequences. Word had spread through the immigrant business community that there were resources available for fighting back against exploitation. "I have something to tell you," Priya said, setting down her teacup and looking at her daughter with an expression that mixed nervousness with excitement. "I've been thinking about Northwestern, about your scholarship, about the year you've deferred."
Isolde felt her stomach tighten slightly. They had talked about college periodically over the past few months, but always in general terms, never making concrete decisions about timing or logistics. "I think you should go," Priya continued. "Not because you have to, not because I'm pushing you to leave, but because I think you're ready now in a way you weren't before." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when you first got that scholarship, you were running towards something. College, independence, opportunities that weren't available here. That's natural and good, but it was also running away from something, from me, and from the life we'd built together." Priya paused, choosing her words carefully. "But now you're not running from anything. You understand this life, this community, these challenges in a way you didn't before. If you go to college now, you'll be going as someone who chooses to expand her world, not escape from it." The distinction was subtle but profound. Isolde thought about the person she'd been on her birthday, excited about college but also naive about the realities her mother faced daily. She thought about the person she was now, someone who understood business planning and client management, who had navigated bureaucratic systems and built community connections, who had learned that education and family loyalty weren't competing priorities. "I've been thinking about it too," she admitted, "about how much I've learned this year, about how that learning could make me more effective in college and afterward. But I've also been thinking about how much I don't want to leave you to handle everything alone again." "You wouldn't be leaving me alone," Priya said. "You'd be leaving me with a stable business, a strong community network, and the confidence that comes from having solved big problems together. That's very different from the situation we were a year ago." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both understanding that they were discussing more than just college logistics. They were talking about trust, trust that their relationship could survive geographic separation, trust that the business would continue to thrive, trust that the community connections they'd built would provide ongoing support for both of them. "There's something else," Priya said, "something I've been working on that I haven't told you about yet." She got up and went to the kitchen, returning with a folder that looked suspiciously like the organized materials Mrs. Patterson had brought to their first intervention meeting. I've been accepted to the Small Business Administration's mentor program. They're pairing me with an established business owner who will help me develop a 5-year growth plan for the catering company. Mom, that's amazing. When did this happen? The acceptance letter came last week, but the program requires a significant time commitment: workshops, mentoring meetings, networking events. It's designed to help small businesses grow from survival mode to sustained success. The timing wasn't coincidental, Isolde realized. Her mother had been planning her own next steps, building toward a level of business stability and community connection that would make it possible for Isolde to pursue her education without feeling like she was abandoning family responsibilities. I want you to know that if you decide to go to Northwestern this year, it won't be because I'm pushing you away or because I don't need you here. It will be because we've built something strong enough to support both of our dreams at the same time. The conversation felt like a completion of the circle that had begun with that devastating birthday fight. They had moved from a relationship built on dependence and sacrifice to one built on mutual support and shared goals. College was no longer a choice between individual success and family loyalty. It had become part of a larger plan that included both. I want to apply for next fall, Isolde said, the decision feeling natural rather than forced. But I want to study business administration with a focus on community development. And I want to spend summers working with you, learning the business, building something we can both be proud of. That sounds perfect, Priya said, her smile brightening the entire room. And it sounds like something we can celebrate.
She disappeared into the kitchen again, returning with a small cake that she'd apparently been hiding all evening. It wasn't elaborate, like the birthday cake that had started their crisis, just a simple vanilla cake with chocolate frosting and a single candle. "What are we celebrating?" Isolde asked, laughing at the surprise of it. "New beginnings," Priya said, lighting the candle. "Second chances. The fact that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what really matters." As Isolde blew out the candle, she thought about all the birthdays they would celebrate in this house that they had fought to save, all the dreams they would pursue now that they understood how to pursue them together, all the other families they might be able to help by sharing the lessons they had learned through their own crisis. The house around them held the same furniture, the same photographs, the same physical markers of the life they had built together. But it also held something new, the knowledge that they were stronger together than apart, that community support could overcome individual vulnerability, and that the American dream was possible when it was pursued not as a solitary journey, but as a collective effort. Later that night, as they finished cleaning up from the evening and prepared for bed, Isolde found herself looking forward to college in a way she hadn't expected, not as an escape from her current life, but as an expansion of it. She would study business administration and community development, learn skills that would make her more effective at supporting immigrant entrepreneurs like her mother, and return home with knowledge and connections that could benefit their entire community. The deferral year hadn't been a setback, it had been preparation. The crisis that had started with a birthday fight and an eviction notice had become the foundation for a stronger relationship, a more sustainable business, and a clearer sense of purpose for both of them. As she turned off the lights and headed upstairs, Isolde realized that she was no longer the person who had walked out of this house in tears 4 months ago. She was someone who understood the value of community, the power of mutual support, and the difference between running toward opportunities and running away from responsibilities. The house settled around them with the familiar creaks and sighs of a building that had weathered storms and remained standing. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: client consultations for Priya, college preparation for Isolde, community meetings and business development workshops, and all the ongoing work of building sustainable success. But tonight, they were home, they were together, and they were ready for whatever came next. 2 years later. The Northwestern University Business Development Fair buzzed with energy as Isolde set up her presentation table, arranging printed materials about the Community Investment Cooperative and the Small Business Justice Coalition next to her laptop and a plate of her mother's samosas that had become legendary among her classmates.
Her senior project on microfinance and community development in immigrant entrepreneurship had evolved far beyond an academic requirement. It had become a blueprint for replicating their hometown's success in other communities. "These smell incredible," said Professor Martinez, stopping by her table during the setup period. "Are these part of your presentation?" "In a way," Isolde smiled, offering him one of the samosas. "They're made by my mother, who's one of the entrepreneurs featured in my research. Her catering business has grown by 300% over the past 2 years, and she's now mentoring other business owners through the same cooperative program that helped save our house." The irony wasn't lost on her that food, the same cultural bridge that had sometimes felt like a burden during her childhood, had become one of her most effective tools for sharing her family's story with her predominantly white, middle-class classmates. The samosas opened. Conversations broke down barriers, made abstract concepts about immigrant entrepreneurship tangible and personal. Professor Martinez took a bite and closed his eyes appreciatively. "This is restaurant quality. How did your mother build such a successful business?" "That's actually the heart of my research," Isolde said, pulling up the first slide of her presentation. "She succeeded not by adapting to exploitative market conditions, but by finding ways to work around them entirely. Community-supported business models, cooperative resource sharing, collective advocacy, approaches that traditional business schools don't usually teach." Her presentation was scheduled for 2 o'clock, but people were already gathering around her table, drawn by the food and staying for the conversation. A group of MBA students was particularly interested in her financial modeling, which showed how cooperative lending could achieve better outcomes than traditional small business loans at lower risk to investors. "You're saying that community investment actually produces higher success rates than bank loans?" asked Jennifer, a second-year MBA student who was writing her thesis on microfinance in developing countries. "Not just higher success rates," Isolde replied, pulling up her data visualization. "Lower default rates, faster business growth, and better community integration. When business owners are supported by people who understand their challenges rather than institutions that see them as risk factors, the outcomes improve across every metric we measured." The conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice calling her name. Isolde looked up to see Maya approaching, now in her senior year at Columbia and visiting Northwestern for a journalism conference. "I cannot believe you made Professor Martinez cry with a samosa. Though I shouldn't be surprised. Your mom's food has always been emotionally devastating." "He didn't cry," Isolde protested, though she had noticed Professor Martinez wiping his eyes while he listened to her explanation of how the cooperative had prevented dozens of foreclosures over the past 2 years. "He definitely teared up. I was watching from across the room." Maya picked up one of Isolde's research summaries, scanning it with the critical eye she'd developed as a journalism major. "This is incredible work, Is. You're basically documenting an entire alternative economic system." "That's exactly what it is," Isolde agreed. "And it's not just theoretical anymore. We've got communities in 3 other states asking for help replicating the model. There's a nonprofit in California that wants to hire me after graduation to help them set up cooperative lending programs in agricultural communities." The opportunity in California was tempting. A chance to apply everything she'd learned on a larger scale, working with migrant farm workers and their families to build sustainable businesses and stable communities. But she was also considering an offer to stay closer to home, working with the State Economic Development Office to create policy frameworks that would make it easier for communities to establish their own cooperative programs. "What does your mom think about California?" asked Maya. "She says I should follow my heart, but also that hearts sometimes need to be informed by practical considerations," laughed. "Very diplomatic, though I think she'd prefer if I stayed closer to home, at least for a few years." The truth is that Priya's business had grown to the point where she could genuinely afford to have Isolde pursue opportunities wherever they led. The catering company now employed 4 part-time staff members, had a waiting list of clients, and had expanded into food truck catering for corporate events. More importantly, Priya had developed a network of business relationships and community connections that provided both financial stability and emotional support.
She's also been talking about running for city council, Isolde added. The immigrant business community has been trying to get better representation in local government, and people keep suggesting she'd be perfect for it. Your mom in politics? That would be amazing. She says she's not interested in politics, just in problem solving. But yeah, I think she'd be incredible at it. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Sarah Kim, the faculty advisor who had helped Isolde develop her research project over the past year. Dr. Kim was a Korean-American economist who specialized in community development, and she'd become both a mentor and a friend during Isolde's time at Northwestern. "How are you feeling about the presentation?" Dr. Kim asked, surveying the growing crowd around Isolde's table. "Good. Nervous, but good. I keep thinking about how much has changed since I started this project. When I first proposed studying microfinance in immigrant communities, I thought I was writing about other people's experiences. I didn't expect it to become so personal." "The best research often does," Dr. Kim replied. "When you care about your subject matter deeply enough to understand it from the inside, that's when you produce work that can actually change things." The personal dimension of Isolde's research had indeed become its greatest strength. Her analysis wasn't just based on economic data and survey responses. It was informed by lived experience, family conversations, and community relationships that provided insights no outside researcher could have accessed. As 2 o'clock approached and the formal presentation began, Isolde found herself looking out at an audience that included not just her classmates and professors, but also several visitors who had driven up from her hometown specifically to hear her speak. Mrs. Patterson was in the front row, beaming with pride. Sophia Hernandez sat beside her, taking notes with the intensity of someone planning to implement everything she heard. And in the back of the room, wearing her best sari and carrying a container of additional samosas, stood Priya. 2.5 years ago, my mother screamed at me to get out of her house on my birthday. We were fighting about college, about family obligations, about whether pursuing individual success meant abandoning community responsibility. That fight led to me being temporarily homeless, to discovering that our house was in foreclosure, and ultimately to understanding that the problems we were facing weren't individual failures, but systemic issues that required community solutions. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a photograph of their house with a foreclosure sale sign in the front yard. "This is where our story started. And this," she clicked to the next slide, showing the same house with a Community Investment Cooperative success story banner hanging from the porch, "is where it led." The presentation that followed was part academic research, part personal narrative, and part policy proposal. Isolde walked her audience through the economic analysis that showed how cooperative lending outperformed traditional banking for small immigrant businesses, the social impact data that demonstrated stronger community ties and lower crime rates in neighborhoods with active business cooperatives, and the policy recommendations that could make it easier for other communities to implement similar programs. But she also told stories. Stories about Hassan's landscaping business and how it had grown from a one-person operation to a company that employed 12 people and specialized in sustainable gardening practices. Stories about Maria, who had finished her associate's degree and was now helping other community college students navigate the financial aid system while working part-time for her mother's expanded cleaning service. Stories about Mrs. Patterson, who had become an unofficial coordinator for the community outreach efforts and had helped prevent 14 foreclosures in the past year alone. The traditional narrative about American success is fundamentally individualistic. We're supposed to believe that if we work hard enough and make good choices, we can overcome any obstacle through individual effort. But what our community has discovered is that individual success built on community support is not only more sustainable, it's also more satisfying.
She clicked to her final slide, which showed a network diagram of all the business relationships, mentoring connections, and mutual support systems that had grown out of the original crisis her family had faced. When my mother's catering business was struggling, the solution wasn't for her to work harder or make better individual choices. The solution was to connect her with other people facing similar challenges, to share resources and information, and to build systems that made it harder for any individual business to fail. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and sustained, but what moved Isolde most was seeing her mother wipe away tears of pride. After the formal Q&A session ended and people began to disperse, Priya made her way to the front of the room. "I am so proud of you," she said, pulling Isolde into a fierce hug. "Not just for this presentation, but for everything you've learned, everything you've become. You are the bridge between our world and their world, but you've never forgotten which side you come from." "I've learned that there don't have to be sides," Isolde replied, "that the goal isn't to choose between worlds, but to build bridges that make both worlds better." 5 years later. The call came on a Tuesday morning while Isolde was reviewing grant applications in her office at the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. She had been working for the state for 3 years now, developing policies and programs that made it easier for communities to establish cooperative business development initiatives. Her work had contributed to the creation of similar programs in 12 Illinois communities, and she was consulting with organizations in 4 other states that were interested in replicating the model. "Isolde, it's Sophia. I have news." The excitement in Sofia Hernandez's voice was unmistakable, and Isolde immediately gave her full attention. "The Federal Small Business Administration just approved our proposal for a national demonstration project. 24 communities across 8 states, 3-year funding commitment, and they want to use our Community Investment Cooperative as the model for the entire program." Isolde felt her heart skip a beat. They had been working on the federal proposal for 18 months, documenting outcomes, refining program components, building partnerships with universities and community organizations across the country. The approval meant that their local success would be scaled up to potentially help thousands of immigrant entrepreneurs and other underserved business owners. "That's incredible," Isolde said, already thinking about the implications. "What kind of timeline are they looking at for implementation?" "They want to start with pilot programs in 6 communities this fall, with full rollout beginning next spring. And, Isolde, they want you to direct the national program. There would be an office in Chicago, a staff of 12, and a budget that would let you work with communities across the entire country." The opportunity was everything Isolde had been building towards since her senior project at Northwestern, but it was also bigger and more complex than anything she had imagined. Directing a national program would mean travel, late nights, the kind of responsibility that could easily consume someone's entire life. It would also mean the chance to help thousands of families avoid the kind of crisis her own family had faced. To build systems that made community support and mutual aid not just possible, but sustainable. "I need to think about it, and I need to talk to my mom." "Of course, but Isolde, this is your chance to change how the entire country thinks about small business development. The research you've done, the programs you've helped create, they work. Now you get to prove that they work everywhere." That evening, Isolde drove home to find her mother in the kitchen, preparing dinner for what had become their traditional Tuesday evening planning session. Ever since Isolde had moved back home after college, initially as a temporary cost-saving measure that had evolved into a permanent living arrangement that worked well for both of them, they had maintained weekly meetings to discuss business developments, community projects, and their individual professional goals.
10 years later. The phone call came on Isolde's 34th birthday while she was sitting in her Chicago office reviewing quarterly reports from cooperative programs that now operated in 47 states and had helped establish over 3,000 successful immigrant-owned businesses. The caller ID showed a number from her hometown, but not one she recognized immediately. "Ms. Chand? This is Rebecca Martinez from the Small Business Administration's National Office. I'm calling because we've just received some remarkable news that I thought you'd want to hear directly." Isolde set down her coffee and gave her full attention to the call. "The Community Investment Cooperative model that you developed has been selected as the basis for a new federal program that will receive $50 million in funding over the next 5 years. The program will be implemented in all 50 states and is being positioned as a cornerstone of the administration's new economic development strategy." The news was almost too large to process immediately. $50 million,
all 50 states. A program that had started with her family's foreclosure crisis was now being recognized as a national model for community economic development. There's more, Rebecca continued. The president is announcing the program next week, and she specifically wants to highlight the story of how local success can be scaled to create national impact. They'd like you to be present for the announcement, and they're particularly interested in having your mother there as well, as one of the original entrepreneurs who helped prove that the model works. After the call ended, Isolde sat in her office looking out at the Chicago skyline and thinking about the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From a teenage girl who had been temporarily homeless because of a family fight, to a national policy director whose work was being celebrated at the highest levels of government, it seemed almost impossible to believe. But more than her own professional success, she thought about what this federal recognition would mean for families facing the same kinds of challenges her mother had faced 15 years ago. $50 million would fund cooperative programs in communities that had never had access to alternative lending, would provide business development support to entrepreneurs who had been excluded from traditional banking, would create the kind of community support networks that could prevent thousands of foreclosures and business failures. She picked up her phone to call her mother, who was now in her second term on the city council and had become something of a regional expert on immigrant economic development policy. "Mom, you're not going to believe this," she began and launched into an explanation of the morning's call.
The White House? Priya's voice was filled with amazement. They want us at the White House? They want to celebrate what we've built together, Isolde corrected. What started with you refusing to give up on your business, with Mrs. Patterson deciding to be a good neighbor, with Sophia and the cooperative believing that community support could work better than individual struggle. I keep thinking about that birthday cake, Priya said, the one that melted while we were fighting. Do you ever think about how different things might have been if we hadn't had that fight? I think about it sometimes, Isolde replied, but I don't think I regret it anymore. That fight, as painful as it was, forced us both to be honest about things we'd been avoiding. It created the crisis that led to us discovering all the resources and relationships that were already there, waiting for us to be brave enough to ask for help. And now other families won't have to go through what we went through. They'll have systems and support from the beginning instead of having to build them from scratch while everything is falling apart. The conversation continued for another hour, with both women marveling at the improbable path that had led from their worst moment to this extraordinary recognition. They made plans for Priya to fly to Chicago the following week so they could travel to Washington together, and discussed how they might use the White House visit to highlight not just their own success, but the hundreds of other entrepreneurs and community organizers who had made the program's growth possible. As Isolde hung up the phone and returned to her quarterly reports, she thought about the 16-year-old version of herself who had walked out of her childhood home carrying nothing but a suitcase and a broken heart. That girl had been running away from what she saw as limitation and toward what she hoped would be freedom. She couldn't have imagined that real freedom would come not from escaping her family's challenges, but from learning how to address them collectively, not from individual success, but from community transformation. The late afternoon Chicago sun was streaming through her office windows, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sounds of the city, traffic and construction, and the general hum of millions of people building their lives alongside each other. It sounded like progress, like possibility, like the kind of future that was worth all the struggle it had taken to create. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Maya, now a successful investigative journalist, who had spent the past 5 years documenting economic inequality in immigrant communities. Just heard about the White House announcement. So proud of you. Also, can you get me an interview with the president about economic policy? Asking for a friend.
Isolde laughed and typed back. Let's start with getting my mom through her first meeting with the president without crying. Then we'll work on your interview. But as she looked around her office, at the walls covered with photographs from cooperative business openings, newspaper articles about successful policy implementations, and thank you letters from families whose lives had been changed by programs she'd helped create, Isolde realized that there was nothing wrong with crying at the White House. Sometimes tears were the only appropriate response to the recognition that impossible things had become possible, that individual struggles had become collective strength, and that the love between a mother and daughter could grow to encompass entire communities. The birthday girl who had driven away from home in tears 15 years ago was now a woman whose work was changing the lives of thousands of families across the country. But more importantly, she was still her mother's daughter, still part of a community that had saved itself by refusing to let anyone face their challenges alone. Tomorrow would bring new policy challenges, new communities to serve, new families to help navigate the complex journey of building sustainable lives in America. Tonight, though, she would drive home to have dinner with her mother in the house they had fought to save, surrounded by the evidence of everything they had built together. The American dream was still possible, Isolde had learned. It just looked different than the mythology suggested. Messier, more collaborative, and infinitely more rewarding than anything that could be achieved alone.